The clinic smelled of antiseptic, cold tile, and crushed dreams. 4-year-old Izuku Midoriya sat on the edge of the examination table, his small legs dangling over the edge, kicking rhythmically against the crinkling sterile paper. In his right hand, he tightly clutched a limited edition All Might action figure, the plastic hero grinning boldly through the oppressive silence of the room. Across from him, illuminated by the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light of an X-ray viewer, stood Dr. Tsubasa. The man was round, balding, and possessed an air of clinical indifference that felt entirely out of place in a room where a child's future was being weighed. He adjusted his thick, round glasses, his gaze shifting from the glowing film to the anxious, trembling form of Inko Midoriya. "You should probably give it up," Dr. Tsubasa said. The words dropped into the room like lead weights. Inko flinched as if she had been struck. She leaned forward, her hands clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "Give it up? But, doctor, is there something wrong with him? Most of the other children in his kindergarten have already manifested their quirks. He's the only one left. We thought maybe he was just a late bloomer." The doctor sighed, tapping a blunt finger against the X-ray film. Specifically, he tapped on the skeletal image of Izuku's small foot. "It's a simple matter of evolutionary biology, Mrs. Midoriya. When quirks first began appearing, researchers conducted extensive studies to figure out the mechanics of the human body's sudden mutation. They found a correlation with the joints in the pinky toe. People with quirks have one joint, a sign of evolutionary streamlining. Your son," he traced the extra joint on the glowing film, "has two. It's a vestige of a bygone era. I'm afraid he will remain quirkless." The silence that followed was deafening. Inko's breath hitched, tears instantly welling in her large green eyes. She looked at her son, her heart breaking into a million jagged pieces for the boy whose only dream was to be a hero like the man he held in his hand. Izuku blinked. The All Might figure in his hand felt suddenly heavy, and with a soft clack, it slipped from his fingers and hit the linoleum floor. He looked down at it. He heard his mother begin to sob softly beside him, her hands covering her face. He heard the doctor murmuring some platitudes about modern society and finding a realistic career path. He knew he was supposed to be crying. He had always been a crier. A loud, snot-nosed, emotionally volatile child who wept at the drop of a hat. But as Izuku sat there, staring at the fallen symbol of peace, an inexplicable sensation washed over him. It wasn't the shattering despair he expected. It wasn't the world-ending grief that normally accompanied the death of a dream. Instead, a strange, phantom heat bloomed in his chest. A voice, or perhaps just a profound, instinctual feeling, echoed in the darkest recesses of his mind. Quirkless? The thought felt foreign, carrying a weight of disdain that didn't belong to a 4-year-old. Why would I need to rely on a parlor trick bred into my blood? True strength isn't given. It's forged. Izuku frowned, his small brow furrowing in confusion. Where had that thought come from? He reached down, picking up the All Might figure. His small hand squeezed the plastic. He felt a sudden, inexplicable ache, not in his heart, but on his left hip. His hand drifted downward, brushing against the fabric of his shorts, instinctively reaching for a weight that wasn't there. 3 weights, specifically. Long, curved, and heavy. He didn't cry. He just felt incomplete. The rain fell in sheets that evening, reflecting the neon lights of Muzutafu on the wet pavement. Inside the Midoriya apartment, the only light came from the glow of a computer monitor. Izuku sat in his rolling desk chair, the screen playing the same video he had watched 1,000 times. The debut of All Might, the catastrophic disaster, the burning wreckage, and the booming, fearless laugh of the symbol of peace emerging from the flames with 12 people on his back. Fear not, citizens. Hope has arrived. Because I am here. The door behind him creaked open. Inko stood in the threshold, her eyes red and puffy, her posture slumped with a heavy guilt she had no business carrying. She looked at her son, bathed in the blue light of the screen, his face unreadable. Izuku, she whispered, her voice trembling. He turned his chair slowly. He pointed a small, chubby finger at the screen, at the smiling giant who defied all odds. Mom, he saves everyone with a smile, no matter what. He's the strongest in the world. Can I be like him? It was the question she had been dreading. The question that would define his life. Inko's resolve broke. She rushed forward, collapsing to her knees and wrapping her arms tightly around her small son. Tears poured from her eyes, soaking into his shirt. I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm so sorry. I wish things were different. She wailed, her voice thick with absolute heartbreak. Izuku sat perfectly still. This was the moment his spirit was supposed to break. His mother was apologizing, essentially confirming that he could never be a hero. He felt her tears, heard her sorrow, and loved her deeply for her empathy. But the strange, foreign resolve that had awakened in the clinic flared up again. He slowly lifted his small hands and placed them on his mother's shaking back. He didn't cry. Instead, his green eyes narrowed slightly, filled with an ancient, stubborn defiance. Apologizing? For what? The shadow in his mind grunted. Tears won't cut through steel. Tears won't make you stronger. If the world says no, you just have to cut the world down to size. It's okay, Ma, Mizuka said, his voice quiet but possessing a strange, rough edge that made Inko pause and look up at him through her tears. I don't need a quirk. Inko stared at him, confused by the absolute certainty in his 4-year-old eyes. Izuku, I don't need it, he repeated, looking down at his small, soft hands. I just need to train. That night, Izuku had the first dream. It was chaotic, fragmented, and loud. He tasted salt on his tongue, ocean spray, thick and heavy. He heard the rhythmic, booming sound of waves crashing against a wooden hull, the creaking of masts, and the snapping of white canvas sails. He wasn't Izuku in the dream. He was older, taller, his body covered in thick, corded muscle and a lattice of jagged, terrifying scars. The most prominent was a massive, diagonal slash across his chest. Instead of fear, the scar brought him a sense of profound pride and a bitter reminder of a defeat he had sworn never to repeat. He held something in his mouth. A sword. The hilt was white, the blade gleaming even in the dim light of his dream. 2 more swords rested in his hands, their weight familiar, comforting, an extension of his very soul. Before him stood an array of monsters, marines, and warlords. But behind him was a boy in a straw hat, laughing brightly, a sun-like presence that radiated pure freedom. I will become the world's greatest swordsman. Anything less would shame the king of the pirates. His own voice, deep, rough, and dripping with bloodlust, roared in the dream. Izuku woke up gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. He sat up in his bed, the sheets tangled around his small legs. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through his curtains, casting long shadows across his room full of hero posters. He pressed a hand to his chest, right where the massive scar had been in the dream. The skin was smooth, untouched. But the ghost of the pain remained, along with a burning, unquenchable thirst for battle. He threw off the covers and walked over to his mirror. A boy with a round face, freckles, and unruly green curls stared back at him. He looked weak. He looked soft. Roronoa, Izuku whispered into the quiet room. The name tasted strange, yet intimately familiar. From that day on, Izuku Midoriya changed. By the time he was 7, the neighborhood kids had noticed the shift in the Midoriya boy. He was no longer the skittish, easily frightened child who trailed behind Katsuki Bakugo like a lost puppy. He was quiet, dangerously intense, and possessed a work ethic that frankly terrified the adults who witnessed it. While other children were at the playground showing off their burgeoning quirks, making sparks fly, elongating their fingers, or floating small rocks, Izuku was in the adjacent woods, carrying rocks that were entirely too heavy for a 7-year-old boy. He would do push-ups until his arms gave out, collapse into the dirt, and then, with a terrifying grimace, force himself up to do 10 more. His hero notebooks, once filled with colorful drawings of pros and detailed analyses of their quirks, had been replaced. Now, the notebooks were filled with sketches of katanas, anatomical diagrams of muscle groups, and sloppy, childishly scrawled treatises on center of gravity and blade maintenance. Katsuki Bakugo hated it. Bakugo was the undisputed king of the playground. His quirk, Explosion, was incredibly powerful, flashy, and inherently violent. He was praised daily as a future top hero. He demanded subservience. He demanded that everyone recognize his superiority. But Izuku, Deku, as Bakugo had dubbed him, refused to play his part. Deku was quirkless. He was supposed to be at the bottom of the food chain. He was supposed to cower, cry, and look at Bakugo with awe and envy. Instead, Deku just looked at him with bored, half-lidded green eyes as if Bakugo were nothing more than a particularly loud, buzzing insect. It infuriated the blond boy to no end. The boiling point came on a humid Tuesday afternoon in the woods behind the local park. Izuku was currently hanging upside down from the thick branch of an oak tree, doing inverted crunches. Sweat dripped from his green curls, splashing onto the leaf-littered ground below. His face was set in a scowl of pure concentration, his core burning in a way that the ghost in his mind told him was good. "Oi, Deku!" Izuku paused his crunch, hanging suspended by his knees. He looked down. Katsuki Bakugo stood at the base of the tree, flanked by his two usual lackeys, a boy with dragon wings and a boy with extendable fingers. Bakugo's red eyes were narrowed, small pops of caramel-scented explosions crackling in his palms. "What do you want, Bakugo?" Izuku asked, his voice steady, lacking any of the tremor it used to hold 3 years ago. "You're in my way, quirkless loser," Bakugo sneered, though they were in the middle of an expansive forest with plenty of room to walk. "Get down here so I can teach you your place," Izuku sighed. It was a long, tired sound that seemed to age him by 10 years. He unhooked his knees and dropped, landing lightly on his feet with a grace that belied his young age. He dusted off his shorts and looked at Bakugo, unimpressed. "I'm busy training. Go play hero somewhere else." The dismissive tone snapped whatever restraint Bakugo had left. "Play hero?" Bakugo roared, lunging forward. "I'm going to be the #1 hero. You're just a pebble in my path. Don't look down on me, you quirkless nobody." Bakugo pulled his right arm back, intending to deliver a devastating, explosive right hook right into Izuku's face. The two lackeys smirked, waiting for the inevitable tears and apologies from the green-haired boy. But the tears never came. Instead, the world ground to a halt. For Izuku, everything suddenly went silent. The rustling of the leaves in the wind, the crackling of Bakugo's explosions, the breathing of the two lackeys, it all faded away into a muted hum. The colors of the forest desaturated, washing out into grays and blacks. The only thing that retained its color was Bakugo. More specifically, a glowing, crimson aura that flared violently around Bakugo's right arm and head. It was intent. Izuku didn't know the word for it yet. He didn't know it was called observation hockey. He only knew that before Bakugo even shifted his weight, Izuku saw the ghost of the attack. He saw the exact trajectory of the fist, the radius of the explosion, and the time it would take to reach his face. It was agonizingly slow. Bakugo's movements, which seemed blindingly fast to the other 7-year-olds, looked like a clumsy, uncoordinated crawl to Izuku. "Too wide," the gruff voice in his mind critiqued. "He's leaving his entire left side open." Amateur. Izuku didn't think. He simply allowed the ghost to guide his body. He shifted his weight slightly, pivoting on his left heel. He tilted his head a mere 2 inches to the right. Bakugo's explosive fist sailed past Izuku's ear, missing him completely. The explosion detonated in empty air, the shockwave ruffling Izuku's messy green hair, but dealing absolutely no damage. Bakugo's eyes widened in shock, his momentum carrying him forward and throwing him entirely off balance. He dodged. Deku dodged, but Izuku wasn't done. As Bakugo stumbled past him, Izuku's eyes locked onto a sturdy, 3-foot-long broken oak branch lying in the dirt. Without breaking his fluid motion, Izuku kicked the branch up with his foot, caught it perfectly by its base with his right hand, and spun. The grip felt divine. It wasn't just a stick. In Izuku's hand, it carried the phantom weight of a legendary blade. Izuku dropped his center of gravity, sinking into a low, predatory stance. He gripped the branch with both hands, bringing it up to his left shoulder. His green eyes darkened, a terrifying, suffocating pressure suddenly leaking from his small frame. It was raw, unrefined, but undeniably lethal. Bakugo recovered his balance and spun around, ready to scream, ready to blast Izuku to ash. But the scream died in his throat. When Bakugo looked at Izuku, he didn't see a 7-year-old quirkless boy holding a stick. For a split, terrifying second, a towering, demonic illusion overlaid Izuku's form. Bakugo saw a monstrous entity clad in dark green robes. The entity had 3 heads, their faces twisted into horrific, bloodthirsty scowls. It had 6 arms, each wielding a massive, jagged katana, but the most terrifying aspect was the eyes, a piercing, glowing, demonic crimson that bored directly into Bakugo's soul, promising absolute, merciless death. Ajura, Bakugo's breath seized. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct in his body, every evolutionary survival mechanism screaming at him to run, to flee, to survive. His knees buckled under the sheer, oppressive weight of Izuku's latent aura. Izuku swung the branch. He stopped it exactly 1 millimeter away from the bridge of Bakugo's nose. The wind pressure generated from the swing, however, did not stop. A sharp, localized gust of wind slammed into Bakugo's face, snapping his blonde hair back and knocking him flat on his backside in the dirt. Silence descended upon the woods. Bakugo sat trembling in the dirt, his red eyes wide with a primal terror he had never experienced before. The 2 lackeys had backed away, their faces pale, entirely paralyzed by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Izuku stood over Bakugo, the branch still held perfectly still in the air. The demonic illusion was gone, leaving only the boy with green curls. But the look in Izuku's eyes was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of mercy. Your attacks are loud, Bakugo, Izuku said softly, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet woods. And they lack weight. Don't point your fists at me unless you're prepared to lose them. He held Bakugo's terrified gaze for 3 long seconds. Then, Izuku lowered the branch, turned his back on the blonde boy, and walked away into the trees, leaving Bakugo trembling in the dirt, his pride shattered by a ghost. As soon as Izuku was out of sight of the others, he collapsed. His knees hit the mossy forest floor, and he dropped the oak branch. He grabbed his head with both hands, a blinding, agonizing pain splitting his skull. It wasn't physical trauma. It was a dam breaking within his mind. The exertion of using observation haki, combined with the manifestation of his aura, had shattered the final mental block separating Izuku Midoriya from the soul that resided within him. Memories flooded his consciousness with the force of a tsunami. He saw a dojo. The smell of polished wood and sweat. He saw a girl with short, dark blue hair holding a real sword, looking down at him. You're too weak, Zoro. He felt the bitter sting of defeat, the moonlit promise. The white sword passed into his hands. Kuina. He saw a cross in a courtyard, ropes biting into his wrists. Starvation gnawing at his stomach. A boy with a straw hat and a wide, idiotic grin breaking into the marine base. You're gonna join my crew? I'm gonna be king of the pirates. The sheer absurdity of it all. The beginning of a journey. He saw a restaurant on the sea. A man with eyes like a hawk and a black blade that parted the ocean. The feeling of absolute, crushing inadequacy. The slash across his chest, the blood spraying into the air, the cold water of the sea rising to meet him. The tears mixing with the salt water as he held his sword to the sky. Luffy, until I defeat him and become the greatest swordsman, I will never lose again. He saw deserts, sky islands, burning government facilities, and ghost ships. He felt the crushing weight of a warlord's pain in a bloody circle on a ruined island. Nothing happened. He saw Wano. He saw a dragon falling from the sky. He felt the king's haki coating his blades, turning them pitch black. He saw the face of his captain, triumphant, achieving his ultimate dream, and then, he saw his end. An old man, his body finally giving out after decades of battle, dying with a sake cup in one hand and his swords leaning against the wall, a satisfied grin on his scarred face. Izuku gasped, his back arching as the final memory settled into place. He fell forward, his forehead resting against the cool, damp earth of the forest. He lay there for a long time, his chest heaving, his small body processing a lifetime of combat, pain, brotherhood, and absolute, unyielding discipline. When Izuku Midoriya finally opened his eyes, they were different. The childish innocence was tempered by the gaze of a veteran killer. The uncertainty was replaced by a steel resolve. He sat up, wiping the dirt from his face. He looked at his small hands, flexing his fingers. I remember, he whispered. He was Izuku Midoriya. He loved his mother. He admired All Might. He wanted to save people with a smile. But he was also Roronoa Zoro. He loved the clash of steel. He revered his old captain. He wanted to cut down the strongest enemies the world had to offer and stand at the absolute pinnacle of power. The two identities did not fight for dominance. They seamlessly merged. Izuku's compassionate, analytical mind blended perfectly with Zoro's stoic, bloodthirsty warrior ethos. If I'm going to be a hero in this world, Izuku murmured to himself, picking up the fallen oak branch, I'm going to need more swords. The transition in the Midoriya household over the next few years was both remarkable and, to Inko Midoriya, deeply perplexing. When Izuku was 8, he formally asked his mother to stop buying him All Might merchandise. Instead, he presented her with a meticulously researched, color-coded binder containing prices, material specifications, and blacksmith reviews for high-quality wooden bakken, practice swords. Inko, desperate to support her quirkless son in any way she could, bought him 3. She expected him to play samurai in the backyard. She did not expect to find him at 5 a.m., doing one-armed handstand push-ups with a massive boulder balanced on his feet, holding one of the wooden swords in his teeth. Izuku! Honey! You're going to break your neck! Inko had shrieked, dropping the laundry basket. Izuku had simply lowered himself down, flipped onto his feet, spat the sword out of his mouth into his hand, and given her a calm, reassuring smile. It's just warm-ups, Mom. I have to condition my jaw muscles if I'm going to use the 3-sword style. 3-sword. Izuku, human teeth are not designed to hold weapons. Mine are, he replied simply, before going back to his push-ups. His training regime was utterly inhuman. Izuku realized quickly that while he possessed Zoro's memories, combat instincts, and the latent potential for hockey, his current vessel was weak. A quirkless human body in this era was fragile compared to the monsters of the Grand Line. If he wanted to channel the destructive power of Santoryu, if he wanted to slice steel and summon tornadoes with raw physical force, he needed a body forged of iron. He spent his days in the municipal gym, terrifying the local bodybuilders by leg-pressing weights that exceeded the machine's recommended limits. He spent his evenings at Dagoba Municipal Beach. At the time, the beach was just beginning to accumulate trash, serving as an illegal dumping ground. Izuku used the heavy appliances, microwaves, rusted car doors, engine blocks, as his personal gym equipment, dragging them across the sand to build his endurance. He trained his hockey in secret. Observation hockey came easiest, naturally attuned to Izuku's highly analytical mind. He learned to sense the presence of people blocks away, to predict the movements of stray dogs, and to navigate the chaotic foot traffic of Muzdalifa blindfolded. Armament hockey, however, was a stubborn beast. He could occasionally summon a flicker of the invisible armor to harden his wooden swords, allowing him to slice cleanly through a discarded refrigerator, but he couldn't sustain it or turn his weapons black. His body simply wasn't robust enough yet to handle the immense spiritual drain. Conqueror's hockey. He didn't try to touch it. He knew it was there, slumbering like a dragon in his chest, waiting for the day his will was absolute enough to unleash it upon the world. Yet, for all his terrifying physical and mental development, there was one fatal flaw that Izuku seemed entirely incapable of fixing. His sense of direction was completely, utterly, and catastrophically broken. It started innocently enough. When he was 9, Inko asked him to run to the convenience store at the end of their street to buy milk. It was a straight line down the sidewalk, no turns required. 3 hours later, Inko received a phone call from a bewildered police officer in Hosas City, 3 train stops and 20 miles away. Mrs. Midoriya? We have your son here. He walked into our precinct carrying 3 wooden swords and demanded to know why we moved the convenience store. When Inko frantically arrived to pick him up, Izuku was sitting in a chair, arms crossed, looking highly irritated. The street clearly curved to the left, Mom, he argued on the train ride home. Izuku, our street is a grid. There are no curves. The clouds were pointing left, he mumbled stubbornly, refusing to admit fault. It became a running gag, a comedic curse that plagued his intensely disciplined life. Izuku could predict a villain's attack 3 seconds before it happened, but he couldn't navigate a simple grocery store without ending up in the employee-only loading dock. He started leaving for school an hour early, strictly because he knew he would inevitably take a wrong turn at a stop sign, end up in an entirely different ward, and have to sprint back to make the bell. The neighborhood bullies, led by a fiercely resentful Bakugo, eventually learned to leave Izuku alone. Bakugo never forgot the day in the woods. The memory of the demonic aura and the glowing red eye haunted his nightmares for months. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the heat. But every time he looked at Deku, who was now broader in the shoulders, carrying 3 wooden swords wrapped in cloth on his back, and walking with the confident, loose-limbed swagger of an apex predator, Bakugo felt a cold spike of fear in his gut. Bakugo still insulted him, of course. He was too proud not to. But he never raised a hand against Izuku again. He kept his distance, his explosive anger masking a deep-seated paranoia. Izuku didn't care. Bakugo was noise. The rest of the middle schoolers were noise. The pro-heroes on the news, showing off their flashy quirks to the media, were noise. Izuku's focus was singular. On the evening of his 14th birthday, Izuku stood in the center of a small clearing in the woods near his home. The moon hung high in the sky, casting silver light through the canopy. He was shirtless, his young, heavily muscled torso gleaming with sweat. He held 2 wooden bakken in his hands, and a third clamped firmly between his teeth. The wood of the mouth sword was heavily indented, shaped perfectly to his jaw over years of grueling use. He closed his eyes, steadying his breathing. He reached deep into his core, past the fatigue of his muscles, tapping into the well of spiritual energy that defined Haki. Focus, he told himself. Let the spirit flow into the blades. They are not tools. They are extensions of your soul. He visualized the black armor. He visualized the weight of steel. He felt the familiar, comforting presence of his past life guiding his current one. His eyes snapped open, blazing with an intense, emerald light. Santoryu. He mumbled through the sword in his mouth, his voice taking on a deep, resonant quality that sounded entirely too dangerous for a 14-year-old boy. He swung all 3 swords in a rapid, synchronized motion. He didn't hit anything physical. He struck the air itself. Tatsumaki, the sheer physical force of the swing, augmented by a minuscule, almost invisible spark of armament Haki, grabbed the ambient air in the clearing and violently twisted it. A localized tornado erupted from his position. The wind howled, ripping leaves from the trees, snapping small branches, and kicking up a violent vortex of dust and debris that reached 30 feet into the air. The spiraling wind pressure tore a neat, circular groove into the dirt surrounding him. 10 seconds later, the wind died down. Leaves drifted lazily back to the earth. Izuku stood in the center of the destruction, breathing heavily, but a savage, triumphant grin split his face. He lowered his swords, spitting the 3rd one into his hand. It wasn't perfect. It was a fraction of the power he had wielded as Zoro. He couldn't cut a mountain in half yet. He couldn't slice a meteor from the sky, but it was a start. He looked up at the moon, his green eyes burning with a promise made across 2 lifetimes. I'm coming, Izuku whispered into the night. Yue High School. The pro-heroes. The villains. I don't care what quirks you have. I'm going to cut through all of it. He sheathed his wooden swords in the cloth bindings on his back, turned on his heel, and confidently strode out of the clearing, ready to head home for dinner. 45 minutes later, he found himself standing at the edge of a massive, heavily polluted beach, surrounded by mountains of rusting trash. He looked around, completely bewildered. Damn it, Izuku sighed, pulling out a crumpled, hand-drawn map his mother had made him, turning it completely upside down. Who put an ocean in the middle of the city? The ghost of the demon had awakened. Now, he just had to find his way to the battlefield. The final bell at Aldera Junior High rang, its shrill electronic buzz cutting through the humid afternoon air. Within seconds, the classroom erupted into a cacophony of scraping chairs, chattering teenagers, and the rustling of textbooks being hurriedly shoved into bags. Izuku Midoriya took his time. He sat at his desk near the back window, carefully wrapping his 3 wooden bakken in a dark green canvas cloth. He didn't just throw them in. He treated the practice weapons with the reverence of a monk handling sacred relics. His hands, calloused and thick with premature muscle, moved with practiced, economic grace. At the front of the room, the homeroom teacher was desperately trying to make himself heard over the din. Remember, career aptitude forms are due by the end of the week. Though, looking at the preliminary results, I suppose practically all of you are aiming for the hero track. The class cheered, a localized light show of minor quirks flashing through the room. Fingers extended, small spheres of water floated, and someone's hair briefly turned to stone. Hey, teach! Don't lump me in with these background characters. Katsuki Bakugo leaned back in his chair, his feet kicked up on his desk. He wore his uniform with his signature arrogant slouch, small pops of caramel-scented explosions crackling playfully in his palms. I'm heading to UA High. I aced the mock exams, and I'm the only one here with the raw power to make it into the big leagues. I'm going to surpass All Might and become the undisputed top hero. The class murmured in a mix of awe and annoyance. Bakugo basked in it, his red eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to challenge him. His gaze swept over the desks, eventually landing on the back corner. Izuku was standing up, slinging the canvas bundle of swords diagonally across his broad back. He didn't look at Bakugo. He didn't flinch at the explosions. His face, framed by messy green curls and a dark green bandana tied loosely around his left bicep, was an impassive mask of utter indifference. Bakugo's jaw twitched. The explosions in his palms fizzled out. He remembered the woods. He remembered the phantom weight of a blade stopping a millimeter from his nose, and the demonic, glowing red eyes that had haunted his sleep for weeks afterward. Bakugo opened his mouth, intending to hurl an insult, to reassert his dominance over the quirkless freak. But Izuku casually shifted his weight, his right hand resting lightly on the pommel of the wooden sword protruding from the canvas wrap. It wasn't a threat. It was a reflex. But the sheer, predatory stillness in Izuku's posture made the words die in Bakugo's throat. Izuku didn't even acknowledge the blonde boy. He picked up his school bag, gave the teacher a curt, polite nod, and walked out the door in total silence. As he passed, the students unconsciously parted for him, a strange, suffocating pressure trailing in his wake. Once he was out of the building, Izuku pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a map his mother had painstakingly drawn for him that morning. Okay, Izuku muttered, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. Mom said the support item blacksmith is 3 blocks east of the school, right next to the train station. If I take a right at the main gate, cut through the park, and go straight, I should be there in 10 minutes. He looked up at the sky. A flock of pigeons was flying in a V formation toward the west. The birds know where the train station is, Izuku reasoned, completely ignoring the map in his hand. He stuffed the paper back into his pocket, turned on his heel, and marched confidently in the exact opposite direction of the blacksmith. 45 minutes later, Izuku was profoundly lost. He found himself walking down a narrow, graffiti-covered alleyway in a commercial district he didn't recognize. The air smelled of burned sugar, exhaust fumes, and an underlying scent of sulfur. Did they move the train station? Izuku grumbled, his hand resting on the hilt of his primary wooden sword. I swear this city rearranges its streets just to piss me off. He paused at an intersection of alleys. He closed his eyes, intending to use a brief pulse of observation haki to sense a crowd, which would logically indicate a main street. The moment his haki flared, he flinched. It wasn't a crowd he sensed. It was a localized epicenter of panic, heat, and a suffocating, malevolent intent. It felt chaotic, desperate, and violently angry, and underneath that massive, swirling mass of malicious energy, he felt another spark. A spark of pure, unadulterated terror mixed with a stubborn, raging will to live. Someone is dying, the ghost in his mind noted clinically. Izuku's eyes snapped open. The annoyance of being lost vanished, replaced instantly by the icy, razor-sharp focus of a swordsman. He didn't run like a panicked civilian. He moved like a predator, his powerful legs propelling him forward in explosive, ground-eating strides. He burst out of the alleyway and onto Tatooine shopping district's main thoroughfare. The street was a war zone. Several buildings were heavily damaged, their storefronts blown out, with thick black smoke billowing into the afternoon sky. A large crowd of onlookers was pressed against a police barricade, holding up their phones and murmuring in frightened, hushed tones. Izuku slipped seamlessly through the gaps in the crowd, his presence masked until he reached the yellow police tape at the front. In the center of the street was a monster made entirely of foul, dark green sludge. The entity was massive, shifting and bubbling like boiling tar. 2 bulbous eyes and a jagged maw full of sludge teeth floated near the top of its mass. But it was what the villain was holding that made Izuku's eyes narrow. Trapped inside the suffocating mass of sludge was Katsuki Bakugo. The blond boy's face was red, his eyes bulging as the foul liquid forced its way into his nose and mouth. In his desperate panic, Bakugo was firing massive explosions from his palms, which only served to start more fires and keep the pro-heroes at bay. Izuku glanced to the side. Standing just behind the police line, a safe distance away from the fires, were the pro-heroes. Death Arms, Kamui Woods, and Empty Lady. It's no good. Death Arms shouted, coughing on the smoke. I can't get a grip on that fluid body. My strength is useless. My wood will catch fire if I get close. Kamui Woods yelled back, shielding his face from the heat. I need 2 lanes of traffic to use my quirk. I can't fit in there. Empty Lady complained, looking completely helpless. Izuku stared at them. A deep, volcanic anger began to bubble in his chest. It wasn't the heroic indignation of a starry-eyed vamp. It was the utter disgust of a battle-hardened warrior witnessing supreme cowardice. Fools, the deep, gruff voice of Roronoa Zoro echoed in his mind. They call themselves warriors, but they stand by and watch a child drown because the conditions aren't perfect. On the sea, you don't complain about a bad matchup. You adapt or you die. Wait until someone with a suitable quirk arrives. Death Arms ordered the police. All we can do is damage control. He'll be dead in 2 minutes, Izuku said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the crackling of the fire and the murmurs of the crowd with eerie clarity. The heroes turned, looking down in surprise at the teenager standing at the police tape. Hey kid! Get back! Death Arms barked. It's not safe. Izuku ignored him. He ducked under the yellow tape and stepped into the clearing. Stop! Kamui Woods yelled, reaching out with a wooden tendril. Izuku sidestepped the tendril without even looking at it, his observation hockey mapping the battlefield with perfect precision. He continued walking toward the raging sludge villain, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. Deku. Bakugo's muffled, agonizing gasp barely reached Izuku's ears. The blond boy's eyes were filled with tears of pain and terror. He was drowning on dry land. What's this? A snack? The sludge villain gurgled, its gelatinous body rippling with cruel amusement. You want to play hero, kid? I'll take your body next. Izuku stopped 10 paces away from the villain. He reached back and grabbed the hilts of 2 of his wooden swords, drawing them with a sharp clack. He stared at the bubbling sludge. Wood is blunt, his mind calculated rapidly. Even if I coated in armament hockey, I'd just be hitting liquid. It will reform instantly. Slashing attacks won't work on a fluid body without Wayne-level Ryu, and I don't have the physical stamina to sustain that yet. With a sigh, Izuku reversed his grip and shoved the wooden swords back into their canvas sheaths on his back. The pros behind him groaned. He realized he can't do anything. Kid, run away! Death Arms screamed, stepping forward to try and grab him. Izuku didn't run. Instead, he planted his feet wide, dropping his center of gravity perfectly. He crossed his arms over his chest, his hands gripping his opposite biceps. His fingers dug deeply into his own flesh, the muscles in his arms bulging, thick veins popping along his forearms. To the untrained eye, it looked like a bizarre defensive posture, but hidden in the crowd, a skeletal, blonde-haired man clutching his bleeding side widened his sunken blue eyes. Toshinori Yagi, All Might, had been berating himself for his weakness, for letting his time limit run out. But as he watched the green-haired boy, the number 1 hero felt a shockwave of raw, unadulterated willpower wash over the street. That stance? Toshinori thought, his breath hitching. That's not a boy giving up. That's a coiled spring. If blades won't cut you, Izuku murmured, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an ancient, terrifying resonance. I'll just have to blow you away. Izuku squeezed his arms tighter. He didn't have a wind quirk. He didn't have magical powers. What he had was a body pushed to the absolute breaking point of human biomechanics, guided by a soul that had once cut through a galleon with a pocket knife. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding, pulling the oxygen from the air around him. He visualized a tornado. He visualized the violent, chaotic rotation of the sea during a grand line storm. Mutoria. No sword style. Izuku uncrossed his arms, throwing them outward with explosive, bone-shattering velocity while simultaneously twisting his hips and violently pivoting his torso. Tatsumaki! Dragon Twister! The physical torque generated by Izuku's body was impossible. The sheer speed and raw strength behind the motion caught the ambient air, compressing it, twisting it, and weaponizing it. Boom! A deafening crack, like thunder in a clear sky, echoed across the shopping district. From Izuku's outstretched arms, a massive, localized cyclone erupted. The air visibly distorted, howling with a shrieking, violent force. The wind pressure blasted forward like a solid wall, ripping the pavement up in chunks and instantly snuffing out the fires burning on the surrounding buildings. The sludge villain didn't even have time to scream. The hyper-compressed wind slammed into the gelatinous body, gripping the sludge and violently spinning it. The sheer centrifugal force was too much for the villain to maintain its cohesion. Gah! The villain roared as his liquid body was literally torn to pieces, splattering against the brick walls and windows of the alleyway. The wind ripped the sludge away from Katsuki Bakugo. The blond boy, gasping for air, suddenly found himself falling forward as the villain holding him was eradicated. Izuku moved. He was a blur of green, crossing the 10 paces in an instant. He caught Bakugo by the collar of his school uniform, hoisted the heavier boy up with one arm effortlessly, and skidded to a halt. The wind died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The fires were out. The sludge villain was reduced to dozens of unconscious, quivering puddles scattered across a 50-foot radius. Izuku stood in the center of the destruction, holding the coughing, sputtering Bakugo by the collar. Izuku's chest heaved slightly, a bead of sweat rolling down his cheek. Performing Mutoria put incredible strain on his ligaments, but his arms remained steady. He looked down at Bakugo, his green eyes cold and entirely unsympathetic. You got sloppy, Bakugo, Izuku said quietly. If you rely entirely on your quirk to fight, you leave your mind open to ambushes. A true warrior is always aware of his surroundings. Bakugo coughed up a mouthful of foul sludge, his red eyes looking up at Izuku. The humiliation, the terror, and the absolute impossibility of what he had just witnessed short-circuited Bakugo's brain. For the first time in his life, Katsuki Bakugo had absolutely nothing to say. The silence in the street was broken by the sound of a slow, heavy clap. Izuku turned his head. Death Arms, Kamui Woods, and Empty Lady were standing frozen, their mouths open in comical shock. The police officers had dropped their barricades. The crowd was dead silent. All Might stood in his skeletal form at the back of the crowd, his fist clenched over his heart. He wasn't clapping. He was trembling with a profound, earth-shattering realization. He didn't hesitate, Toshinori thought, staring at the quirkless boy who had just done the impossible. While heroes with power stood by making excuses, a boy with nothing but his own 2 hands stepped into hell to save a life. Suddenly, the pro-heroes snapped out of their stupor and rushed forward. Kid! What the hell were you thinking? Death Arms yelled, grabbing Izuku by the shoulder. You could have been killed. That was incredibly reckless. You leave villain fighting to the professionals. Kamui Woods nodded in agreement. Using an unregistered quirk in public is a violation of the law. Even if you saved him, you interfered with official hero work. Izuku turned slowly. He let go of Bakugo's collar, letting the boy slump to the ground. Izuku looked at the hand on his shoulder, then looked up at Death Arms. The pro-hero suddenly felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The green-haired boy's eyes held no respect, no deference to his status. They were the eyes of a wolf looking at a particularly noisy sheep. Interfered? Izuku repeated, his voice dangerously low. With what work? Watching him die. Death Arms bristled. Listen here, you little brat. No, you listen, Izuku interrupted, his tone laced with a heavy, localized pulse of conqueror's hockey. It wasn't enough to knock the heroes out, but the air around Izuku suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Death Arms instinctively took a step back, releasing his grip on the boy. The crowd fell silent again, oppressed by the sudden, overwhelming weight of the teenager's aura. You call yourselves professionals, Izuku said, his voice carrying clearly to every person on the street. You stood there and complained about bad matchups. You let a civilian slowly suffocate because the conditions weren't perfect for your abilities. He pointed a callous finger at the scattered sludge. A title doesn't make you a hero. A license doesn't make you a warrior. If you possess the power to act, and you choose to stand by and watch the weak suffer, you are nothing but cowards hiding behind a badge. Kamui Woods recoiled as if slapped. Empty Lady looked down at her boots, her cheeks burning with intense shame. Izuku scoffed, turning his back on the pros. He adjusted the canvas strap of his swords, ignoring the flashing cameras of the crowd. Pathetic, he muttered to himself, walking right past the police tape. No one dared to stop him. 2 hours later, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the streets of Musudafu. Izuku was still walking. I don't understand, he muttered, turning his map sideways. I took a left at the burning building. The sun sets in the west. My house is in the east. So why am I at a port? He stood on the edge of a concrete pier, looking out at the shimmering ocean. Seagulls cried overhead. Young man! Izuku paused. He recognized that voice. It was booming, theatrical, and carried an undeniable weight of authority. He turned around. Standing at the entrance to the pier, practically glowing against the sunset, was All Might in his muscular form. The symbol of peace was breathing heavily, sweat dotting his brow, as if he had been sprinting all over the city. I am here! All Might announced, though he quickly coughed and broke character. Ahem. I have finally found you. Good grief, young man, your pathing through the city is entirely incomprehensible. I've been tracking you for 2 hours. Izuku blinked. I wasn't hiding. I'm just taking a shortcut home. All Might looked at the ocean, then back at Izuku. Your home is in the opposite direction. 5 miles away. The map is wrong, Izuku replied smoothly, completely unbothered. All Might laughed, a booming, genuine sound. But a moment later, a cloud of steam erupted from the massive hero's body. Izuku watched, mildly curious but entirely unfazed, as the giant shrunk down into a skeletal, haggard man spitting up a terrifying amount of blood. Toshinori wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, expecting the boy to scream in terror at his shattered illusion. Instead, Izuku just tilted his head. Curse? Or an old war wound? Toshinori stared at him, taken aback. You're not surprised? I've seen a man with a spring in his head bounce off buildings, and a guy who turned into a giant leopard. Izuku shrugged, referencing his past life on the Grand Line. A deflation trick isn't that shocking. You look like you took a bad hit to the respiratory system, though. Toshinori sighed, a fond, weary smile touching his face. You have a remarkable spirit, young man. Yes, 5 years ago, I sustained a grievous injury from a villain. Half my respiratory organs were destroyed. I can only do hero work for about 3 hours a day now. He stepped closer to Izuku, the jovial hero persona dropping completely. He stood tall, despite his frail frame, projecting an aura of absolute sincerity. I came here to thank you, and to apologize, Toshinori said, bowing his head slightly. I was there in the crowd today. I was pathetic. My time limit was up, and I allowed my weakness to justify my inaction, but you had no quirk registered on file. The police told me you are officially classified as quirkless. And yet you acted. You taught me a lesson today, Izuku observed the man quietly. He engaged his observation haki. What he saw took his breath away. Inside this frail, broken, dying man was an aura that blazed like a miniature sun. It was an indomitable will, an unyielding pillar of strength forged not by a quirk, but by a genuine, consuming desire to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. It was the exact same energy Izuku had felt radiating from Monkey D. Luffy. It was the aura of a king. You aren't pathetic, Izuku said, his voice shedding its usual rough edge, replaced by deep respect. A man who gives his own organs to protect others has earned his rest. But a true king doesn't stop fighting until his heart stops beating. I know that feeling. Toshinori looked up, his blue eyes locking onto Izuku's piercing green ones. The hero felt a profound connection to this strange, intense boy. What is your name, young man? Izuku Midoriya. Midoriya, Toshinori said, tasting the name. You told the heroes that true strength isn't about licenses. You generated a windstorm with nothing but physical strength and technique. How? Discipline, Izuku answered, resting a hand on his swords. I've trained every day of my life to wield these. My strength comes from the blade, and the will to cut down my enemies. You want to be a hero? I want to be the greatest swordsman in the world, Izuku corrected softly. And I want to protect the people who can't protect themselves. Being a hero seems to be the best way to do both. Toshinori smiled. It was a radiant, hopeful expression. Top heroes have stories about them from their school days. Most of their stories have one thing in common. Their bodies moved before they had a chance to think. Izuku's eyes widened slightly. He remembered the feeling in the alleyway. The ghost in his mind had moved him before he even consciously decided to act. That was true for you today, wasn't it? Toshinori asked. Izuku nodded slowly. Toshinori stood up straight, raising a hand to the sky. You are worthy to inherit my power, Izuku Midoriya. Izuku frowned. Inherit? I thought quirks were genetic. Most are, Toshinori explained, his voice ringing with reverence. But mine is a sacred torch, passed down from generation to generation. It is a quirk that stockpiles raw power and passes it on to the next user. It is called One for All. Toshinori lowered his hand, pointing it directly at Izuku. I have been searching for a successor. Someone with the heart of a true hero. I offer it to you. Will you accept my power? Izuku stood silent on the pier. The ocean breeze ruffled his green curls. His first instinct, the pride of Roronoa Zoro, was to reject it. I don't need handouts. I carved my own path with my swords. But Izuku Midoriya, the boy who had worshipped All Might, the boy who analyzed everything with a sharp, tactical mind, paused. He thought about the warlords of the sea. He thought about the emperors. He thought about Wano, WCI, and the monsters that roamed his past life. He remembered how his haki felt inadequate in this new, fragile body. One for All stockpiles raw power, Izuku reasoned. Haki is spiritual energy drawn from physical vitality. If this quirk forcibly enhances my body's physical limits, it won't just make me punch harder. It will be the ultimate battery for armament haki. It could push Wado, Sandai, and Shusui beyond black blades. It could create something entirely new. He looked at Toshinori. He saw the dying king offering him his crown. Izuku didn't cry. He didn't bow in frantic, unworthy gratitude. He drew his primary wooden sword from his back and planted the tip on the concrete pier. He knelt on one knee, resting his hands on the pommel, bowing his head in the traditional, solemn oath of a retainer pledging loyalty to his captain. I accept your power, All Might, Izuku swore, his voice echoing over the waves. I will take your will, and I will forge it into a blade that can cut through any evil in this world. That is my promise to you. Toshinori felt a tear slip down his cheek. He had found him. The perfect successor. Excellent! Toshinori cheered, clapping his hands together. Then, we begin your training immediately. UA's entrance exam is in 10 months. We will need every single day to rebuild your body so it doesn't explode when you take in One for All. Izuku stood up, tilting his head. Explode? Yes. If your vessel isn't strong enough, the sheer power will blow your limbs off. Toshinori laughed heartily. So, meet me at Dagoba Municipal Beach tomorrow at 6 a.m. We have a 10-month American dream plan to complete. Dagoba Municipal Beach was a disaster. Once a picturesque stretch of coastline, illegal dumping over the years had turned it into a towering, unstable mountain range of rusted refrigerators, crushed cars, broken washing machines, and shattered glass. The smell was atrocious, a mix of rotting seaweed and rusted iron. Toshinori Yagi stood at the top of the stairs leading down to the beach, holding a thick binder labeled the American Dream Plan. It detailed a grueling, 10-month workout regime designed to push a teenage boy to his absolute physical limits. He checked his watch. 6:05 a.m. Perhaps I was too hard on him, Toshinori mused to himself. He is only 14. Maybe he overslept. Suddenly, a loud, screeching sound of metal tearing against metal echoed from the beach. Toshinori looked down, and his jaw dropped. Izuku was already there. He was shirtless, wearing only dark green sweatpants. But he wasn't doing jumping jacks or stretching. He had found the rusted chassis of a pickup truck. He had tied a thick, rotting nautical rope to the front bumper. The other end of the rope was tied securely around Izuku's waist. Izuku wasn't just pulling the truck. He was doing walking lunges through the deep, resistant sand, dragging the 2-ton piece of scrap metal behind him with every agonizing step. Furthermore, he had a long, heavy iron pipe clamped horizontally between his teeth, completely preventing him from breathing through his mouth. His muscles were bulging, flushed bright red with exertion, his entire body drenched in sweat. "Young Midoriya!" Toshinori yelled, rushing down the stairs. "What are you doing? That's not on the schedule." Izuku paused his lunge. He spat the iron pipe out of his mouth into his hand and panted heavily through his nose. "Warm-ups," Izuku grunted, wiping the sweat from his eyes. "I got here at 4 a.m. I couldn't sleep." 4 in the morning? Toshinori balked, looking at the massive trench the truck had carved in the sand. "Young man, you are going to destroy your joints. We have to follow the plan to properly build your vessel." Izuku looked at the binder in Toshinori's hands. "What's in there?" "This is the 10-month regime designed to clear this beach and build your muscles to handle one for all." Izuku looked out over the massive piles of trash. His eyes, hardened by memories of training with Mihawk on Kurigana Island, narrowed in assessment. 10 months is too slow, Izuku said bluntly. "My body is already conditioned for heavy lifting. I need to push past hypertrophy and focus on explosive fast twitch fibers, as well as jaw and neck conditioning for the 3-sword style. I'll clear this beach in 3. Toshinori laughed nervously. "Young Midoriya, I admire your enthusiasm, but it's physically impossible to clear this much mass in 3 months without a strength quirk." Izuku just smirked, a wild, feral expression that sent a jolt of electricity through Toshinori. "Watch me." Thus began the most terrifying 3 months of Toshinori Yagi's life. The American Dream Plan was unceremoniously thrown into the ocean. Izuku took absolute control of his own physical conditioning, guided by the brutal, merciless regimen of Roronoa Zoro. He didn't just move the trash, he attacked it. Toshinori watched in bewildered awe as Izuku used a discarded car bumper to practice his sword swings, holding the rusted metal in his teeth and performing hundreds of vertical slashes until the metal literally bent from the force of air resistance. Izuku treated the refrigerators as blocking dummies, using his bare fists and elbows to dent the steel, forcing his skin and bones to harden through microfractures, constantly chasing the elusive feeling of armament hockey. There was, however, one massive problem. "Midoriya, where are you going?" Toshinori yelled through a megaphone on a brisk Tuesday morning in month 2. Izuku was currently dragging a stack of 4 washing machines tied together with a cable. He had his head down, pushing through the pain, but instead of walking toward the designated dump trucks parked at the top of the stairs, Izuku was marching steadily south, down the coastline, away from Dagoba Beach entirely. Izuku stopped, spitting out his makeshift iron-mouthed sword. "To the dump trucks, all might. The trucks are behind you. You're walking toward Hosa City." Izuku looked over his shoulder, squinting at the large yellow trucks parked not 50 feet away. He looked back down the empty coastline. He scowled. "The wind told me south," Izuku grumbled stubbornly, turning around and dragging the washing machines back. This became a daily occurrence. Because Izuku refused to look at landmarks and relied entirely on his instincts, he frequently wandered off the main beach. By the end of the 2nd month, Toshinori realized that Izuku hadn't just cleared half of Dagoba Beach, he had accidentally cleared 2 miles of adjacent, privately owned coastline because he kept getting lost while carrying trash. "He's a geographical anomaly," Toshinori muttered to himself, watching Izuku confidently carry a microwave in the wrong direction for the 4th time that hour. But his spirit is terrifying. As the weeks turned into months, the physical transformation in Izuku was undeniable. The soft, rounded edges of his childhood had been completely burned away in the forge of his training. At 14, he possessed a physique that rivaled professional athletes. His shoulders were incredibly broad, his chest heavily muscled, and his arms were wrapped in thick, corded muscle designed for explosive torque and sustained endurance. More importantly, his aura had changed. The suffocating, demonic pressure he leaked when angry was becoming more controlled, concentrated into a razor-sharp intent that made Toshinori sweat just standing near him. On the final day of the 3rd month, 7 months ahead of schedule, Toshinori arrived at the beach just before sunrise. He stepped out of his truck and froze. The beach was entirely pristine. Not a single piece of trash remained. The sand was smooth, untouched save for a single set of footprints leading toward the water. The rising sun cast a brilliant, fiery glow over the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. Standing at the edge of the water, silhouetted against the rising sun, was Izuku. He was shirtless, his heavily scarred hands resting on the hilts of his wooden swords. He stood perfectly still, breathing in time with the crashing waves, completely at peace. Toshinori transformed into his muscular state, feeling a swell of absolute pride. Oh my! Oh my goodness! All Might roared, rushing down the stairs. You actually did it! You cleared the entire beach. And you even cleaned the neighboring beach down to the marina! Izuku turned around, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. The marina was an accident. But yeah, it's done. My vessel is ready. All Might stopped in front of the boy. He looked at Izuku's eyes. There was no fear. No hesitation. Only a quiet, burning readiness to take on the weight of the world. You went far beyond my expectations, young Midoriya, All Might said, his booming voice softening with profound respect. You have forged your body into a blade worthy of this power. You truly are a hero. All Might reached up and plucked a single, golden strand of hair from his head. He held it out toward Izuku. Now, the final step, All Might said, a massive grin on his face. Eat this. Izuku stared at the hair. The romantic tension of the moment evaporated instantly. Eat your hair? Izuku asked, his eyebrow twitching. Yes. To inherit the power, you must consume some of my DNA. It's the only way. Izuku crossed his arms, channeling his inner Zoro. You want me, a swordsman who prides himself on dignity and discipline, to eat a random strand of hair from a middle-aged man's head. It's the mechanism of the quirk. Just swallow it down, Izuku sighed. He had eaten worse on the Grand Line. He had eaten sea kings that were rotting, and Wano wildlife poisoned by factories. A hair was nothing. He snatched the hair from All Might's hand, tossed it into his mouth, and swallowed it dry without flinching. Done, Izuku said, grimacing at the texture. When do I feel it? It will take a few hours to digest and integrate into your nervous system. All Might cheered, clapping Izuku on the back hard enough to stagger a normal man. Izuku didn't budge. By the time the UA entrance exam begins, you will have access to one for all. Izuku nodded, turning back to look at the ocean. He reached back, his fingers tracing the cheap canvas wrap holding his wooden swords. I need real steel, Izuku murmured to himself. Wooden blades won't survive the friction of this power. What was that, my boy? Nothing, Izuku said, turning to walk up the stairs. I'm going home to shower. The exam is in a few months, and I need to find a blacksmith who won't ask questions when a 14-year-old orders 3 katanas. All Might laughed, watching his successor walk away. 10 minutes later, All Might's phone buzzed. It was a text from Izuku. I took a left at the stairs and ended up at a fish market. Which train goes to Musudafu? All Might just sighed, shaking his head. The boy had the strength of a god and the heart of a king, but he desperately needed a GPS quirk. Godspeed, young Midoriya, All Might whispered to the wind. The world isn't ready for you. The wooden bakken were gone, retired to a makeshift shrine in the corner of Izuku Midoriya's bedroom. They had served their purpose. They had endured the brutal, grueling 3 months of the American dream plan, absorbing the sweat, blood, and unyielding will of a boy forging himself into a weapon, but wood could not hold the power of one for all. Wood would shatter under the immense, spiraling torque of the three-sword style. Izuku needed steel. It had taken a significant amount of his mother's savings, a small grant from All Might, and a painfully long email exchange with the Custom Weapons Division of the Detonarat Company to get what he needed. Under the current laws, support items designed as lethal weaponry required extensive licensing. Izuku had skirted this by registering his quirk under the provisional title of Weaponized Aura, claiming the swords were necessary conduits for his energy, blunted just enough to pass civilian safety regulations, but sharp enough to slice through armor when combined with his abilities. They had arrived 2 days before the UA entrance exam, encased in a sleek, reinforced titanium carrying case. Now, standing in front of his full-length mirror on the morning of the exam, Izuku strapped the 3 scabbards to his right hip. He wore a dark green, fitted tracksuit that hugged his heavily muscled frame, but around his waist he had tied a thick, forest green haramaki, a traditional stomach band. It provided excellent core support, and to the ghost residing in his soul, it felt incredibly right. He rested his left hand on the 3 hilts protruding from his sash. The first was a masterpiece of modern metallurgy, designed exactly to Izuku's specifications from his memories. It possessed a pure white hilt, a circular, unadorned handguard, and a pristine, polished steel blade. It was his tribute to the Wado Ikimonji. The second featured a crimson-wrapped hilt with a cross-shaped guard. The blade itself possessed a distinct, jagged hamon, temper line, resembling tongues of fire. The Detonarat smiths had complained it was a needlessly complicated aesthetic, but Izuku had insisted. The Sandai Kitetsu. The third was the heaviest. It had a dark purple grip, a flower-shaped guard, and a blade that had been specially anodized to a deep, matte black, adorned with a crimson, saw-toothed temper line. Shusui. Izuku drew the white-hilted sword an inch from its scabbard with his thumb. The cold sheen of metal filled the quiet bedroom. He could feel it, the latent, thrumming stockpile of energy resting in the pit of his stomach. One for all. He had eaten the hair. The power had integrated into his nervous system over the last 10 months. He hadn't tested it yet. All Might had strictly forbidden him from unleashing the stockpile before the exam, warning him of the catastrophic recoil. But Izuku's observation haki could sense the power inside him. It felt like a raging, swirling ocean, desperate to break through a dam. Let it roar, the swordsman in his mind grinned. We'll cage the storm with steel. Izuku! You're going to be late. Inko's voice called from the kitchen. Izuku snapped the sword back into its sheath. He grabbed his dark green bandana from his desk, tying it securely around his left bicep. Coming, Mom, he replied, his voice deep, steady, and entirely devoid of nerves. Inko was waiting by the front door, wringing her hands nervously. She looked at her son. He was 14, but he carried himself like a veteran of 100 wars. The sheer breadth of his shoulders and the heavy, dangerous steel strapped to his waist made him look like a pro-hero already. Do you have your admission ticket? Your ID? Did you pack a lunch? Inko fretted, reaching up to adjust the collar of his jacket. I have everything, Ma, Izuku said gently, placing a calloused hand over hers. Inko looked up into his piercing green eyes and felt a wave of calm wash over her. The frantic anxiety that usually plagued her evaporated. You look like a hero, Izuku. I'm so proud of you. I'll be back this afternoon, Izuku promised. He gave her a small, confident nod, stepped out the door, and headed for the train station. The journey to Yue High School was supposed to be a simple, 20-minute train ride followed by a 5-minute walk from the station to the massive gates of the campus. An hour later, Izuku stood in front of a sprawling, industrial shipping yard, watching cranes load shipping containers onto a massive cargo freighter. The air smelled of diesel and salt water. Izuku frowned, pulling his Yue admission pamphlet from his pocket, and looking at the small map printed on the back. He turned the pamphlet upside down, then sideways. This map is deliberately misleading, Izuku concluded, crossing his arms. The train conductor clearly announced the Yue stop, so why is there a port here? Did they disguise the school as a boat to test our situational awareness? He took a step toward the cargo ship, fully prepared to board it, and demand to know where the written exam was being held. Excuse me, Izuku paused, turning his head. Jogging toward him was a girl about his age. She had a round, cheerful face, permanent pink blush on her cheeks, and a short bob of brown hair that bounced with every step. She was wearing a standard middle school uniform and carrying a small backpack. She stopped a few feet away, panting slightly, her large brown eyes looking at him, then down at the 3 very real, very lethal-looking swords strapped to his hip, and then back up to his face. Are you lost? She asked, her tone entirely polite but laced with unmistakable bewilderment. Izuku maintained a perfectly stoic expression. No. I am investigating the perimeter of the examination site. The girl blinked. She pointed a finger over her shoulder. But Yue High School is that way. We got off at the same train stop, and I saw you take a hard left into the industrial sector instead of following the giant signs pointing to the campus. The exam starts in 30 minutes. Izuku stared at her. He looked at the ship. He looked back at her. Never admit defeat, Zoro's pride grunted in his mind. I was testing a shortcut, Izuku said smoothly, not missing a beat. The wind currents are clearer in this sector, but since you seem to know the conventional route, I will accompany you to ensure you don't get lost. The girl's lips twitched, fighting a massive smile. Right. Okay. I'm Achiko Uraraka, by the way, Izuku Midoriya. Well, Midoriya, follow me. We have to hurry. Uraraka took the lead, glancing back every few seconds to make sure the heavily armed, intensely serious green-haired boy hadn't wandered off into a warehouse. Izuku followed closely, his hand resting casually on his swords. He analyzed her gait. She walked lightly, almost as if she were trying to prevent her feet from sinking into the pavement. A gravity or weight manipulation quirk, he surmised easily. Thanks to Uraraka's unyielding guidance, they arrived at the towering, glass-paneled gates of Yue High with 10 minutes to spare. Phew! We made it! Uraraka cheered, clapping her hands together. Thanks for the escort, Midoriya. Good luck on the exam. Keep your guard up, Izuku replied simply. And don't rely entirely on your quirk if you get cornered. A strike to the throat works just as well. Uraraka stared at him, slightly horrified but mostly intrigued by the utter seriousness in his tone. I'll keep that in mind. Bye. Izuku watched her walk into the building before turning his attention to the massive campus. He could feel hundreds of presences buzzing inside, a chaotic symphony of nervous energy, bravado, and fear. He took a deep breath, stepping through the gates. The atmosphere shifted. This wasn't a school, it was a battlefield. And Izuku was ready for war. The written exam was trivial. Over the past 10 months, Izuku hadn't just trained his body, he had rigorously maintained his mind. He blitzed through the mathematics, history, and hero law sections with mechanical efficiency, finishing a full 20 minutes early. He spent the remainder of the time meditating at his desk, his breathing slow and measured, gathering his spiritual energy. When the written portion concluded, the examinees were herded into a massive, stadium-style auditorium for the practical exam orientation. Izuku found his assigned seat. He slid in, placing his wrap swords carefully across his lap. Get your weapons out of my space, Deku. Izuku didn't turn his head. He recognized the aggressive, gravelly voice immediately. Katsuki Bakugo was sitting in the seat directly to his right, glaring at him with a mixture of intense hatred and buried paranoia. The armrest is the boundary, Bakugo, Izuku replied, his voice calm, staring straight ahead at the empty stage. My scabbards are a full inch within my designated seating area. If your spatial awareness is that poor, you're going to fail the practical. Bakugo's hands sparked under the desk, the smell of burnt caramel wafting into the air. Don't get cocky just because you learned some parlor tricks with sticks, you quirkless freak. Real villains won't care about your samurai roleplay. We'll see, Izuku said softly, ending the conversation. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight snapped onto the stage. The voice hero, Present Mike, burst from behind the curtain, leaning back and throwing a peace sign to the crowd. What's up, UA candidates? Let me hear you say he. Dead silence. Present Mike winced but recovered instantly. Tough crowd. That's fine. Let's get right into the main event. The practical exam. You'll be conducting 10-minute mock urban battles in one of our simulated city centers. You can bring whatever you want. After this presentation, head to your assigned battle center. The screen behind him lit up, displaying a graphic of 3 different robots. There are 3 types of foe villains in every center. They are worth 1, 2, or 3 points depending on their difficulty. Your goal is to use your quirks to incapacitate these villains and rack up a high score. Excuse me. A tall, broad-shouldered boy with neatly parted blue hair and rectangular glasses shot up from his seat, raising his hand perfectly rigid in the air. A spotlight instantly hit him. On the printout, there are 4 types of villains. If this is a misprint, then UA, the most prominent academy in Japan, should be ashamed of this foolish mistake. Furthermore, the boy turned abruptly, his finger pointing directly at Izuku's row. You, the boy with the unruly green hair and the 3 swords. You have been carrying lethal weapons onto a school campus, and you have been sitting there with your eyes closed during this entire presentation. If you are not taking this seriously, leave at once. Bakugo smirked, ready to watch Izuku get publicly humiliated. Izuku slowly opened his eyes. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. But he turned his head and locked eyes with the blue-haired boy. A heavy, oppressive stillness suddenly descended on the immediate rows surrounding Izuku. It was a fraction of a percent of Conqueror's haki, just enough to make the air feel thick and hard to breathe. I closed my eyes because the spotlight is glaring, Izuku said, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent auditorium. And these weapons are registered support items, cleared by the UA administration for my combat style. You are wasting the pro-hero's time by interrupting his presentation to police your fellow examinees. Sit down and let him finish. The blue-haired boy, Tenya Ida, felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. The sheer authority in Izuku's voice left no room for argument. Ida's mouth opened, closed, and he promptly sat down, looking deeply unnerved. President Mike coughed into his microphone, breaking the tension. Oh, okay then. Thanks for the segue. Examinee 7111. The fourth villain is worth 0 points. It's an obstacle, a massive gimmick that will rampage in close quarters. My advice? Run away when you see it. Izuku nodded to himself. A pure obstacle. Engaging it is a waste of stamina. Focus on the grunts. That's all from me. President Mike cheered. I leave you with our school motto. Plus ultra. Now, go get ready to bleed. Battle Center B was a marvel of modern engineering. It was a fully realized, life-sized replica of a metropolitan city, complete with skyscrapers, alleyways, and intersections, all enclosed within massive concrete walls. Dozens of examinees stood nervously before the towering metal gates. Some were stretching, others were hyperventilating, and a few were showing off their quirks to psych themselves up. Izuku stood near the back of the pack. He had slipped off his tracksuit jacket, wearing only a tight black tank top and his green haramaki. He reached up and pulled the dark green bandana from his bicep. With practiced, deliberate movements, he tied it around his head, securing it tightly over his messy green curls. The moment the knot was tied, Izuku Midoriya's demeanor vanished. The analytical fanboy, the polite son, the quiet student, they receded into the depths of his mind. What remained was the pure, unfiltered essence of Roronoa Zoro. His posture slouched slightly into a relaxed, predatory stance. His green eyes darkened, losing their warmth, replaced by a cold, calculating bloodlust. He rested his left hand on the 3 hilts at his hip. A few feet away, Tenya Ida watched the green-haired boy. Ida frowned, adjusting his glasses. He's trying to look intimidating, Ida thought, attempting to rationalize the fear he had felt in the auditorium. But physical weapons are obsolete in modern heroics. A quirk will always outclass mere steel. High above the battle centers, in a darkened, multi-monitor observation room, the UA faculty watched the candidates. We have a promising crop this year, Midnight purred, crossing her legs as she watched the screens. A lot of raw, flashy power. Flash doesn't equal survival, an exhausted, monotone voice replied. Shota Aizawa, Eraserhead, was wrapped in his yellow sleeping bag, his bloodshot eyes scanning the monitors. Oh? Does anyone catch your eye, Eraser? Asked Nizu, the principal of UA, taking a sip of tea from a porcelain cup. Behind them, standing in the shadows of the room in his skeletal form, Toshinori Yagi leaned forward, his eyes glued to the monitor displaying Battle Center B. Show them, my boy, Toshinori thought, his heart pounding. Show them what a true warrior looks like. Aizawa unzipped his sleeping bag and pointed a bandage-wrapped finger at the screen. That kid in the back. The one with the 3 katanas. He's the only one who isn't looking at the gates. The teachers turned their attention to Izuku. He's completely still, Snipe noted, leaning closer to his monitor. His breathing is perfectly rhythmic. He's in a state of absolute focus. Weapons are allowed, but rarely effective against the armor plating of the robots, Ectoplasm observed. Unless he has a strength or edge-enhancing quirk, he will struggle. He's quirkless, Aizawa read off his tablet, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. registered under a provisional weaponized aura support clause. We'll see if he's a fool or a prodigy. Suddenly, Present Mic's voice boomed over the loudspeakers at the battle center. Start! The massive metal gates groaned and began to swing open. The other examinees hesitated, waiting for the gates to fully part, waiting for a countdown, waiting for a sign. Izuku didn't wait. He dropped his center of gravity. For the first time, he reached inward and tapped the dam holding back One for All. He didn't unleash it completely. He merely siphoned a trickle of the raging power, channeling 5% of the stockpile directly into the muscles of his legs. Emerald green lightning instantly sparked around his calves, crackling with violent energy. Bang! The concrete beneath Izuku's feet shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. He exploded forward with the speed of a fired artillery shell. He slipped through the partially opened gates before they were even a foot wide, leaving the other examinees standing in shock. Hey! What are you doing? Ida yelled. The gates aren't fully open yet. What are you waiting for? Present Mike screamed over the speakers. There are no countdowns in real battles. That swordsman is already racking up points. Go, go, go! Panic erupted as the examinees finally surged forward into the city. Inside the city, Izuku was a green blur. He didn't run down the center of the street. He vaulted off a parked car, scaled a streetlight, and landed lightly on the roof of a 3-story building. His observation hockey expanded, covering a 3-block radius. The city was suddenly painted in his mind's eye, the mechanical, soulless auras of the faux villains glowing brightly. 3 one-pointers to the north. A cluster of 2-pointers in the eastern plaza. And a 3-pointer lying in ambush around the next corner. Let's start with the big one, Izuku whispered. He leaped off the roof, plunging down into the alleyway below. As he fell, he drew Wado Ikimanji with his right hand and Sandai Kitetsu with his left. The 3-pointer, a massive, tank-like robot with heavy treads and twin missile launchers, turned its optical sensors upward as Izuku descended. It raised its launchers, preparing to fire a barrage of rubber suppression rounds. Izuku didn't even blink. He channeled 5% of One for All into his arms. The green lightning traveled up his biceps, wrapping around his forearms, and bled into the steel of his swords. The blades hummed, vibrating with the sheer kinetic energy coursing through them. He landed on the hood of the robot, the metal buckling under his weight. Nitoryu. Two-sword style. Izuku crossed the 2 blades in front of his chest. He visualized the steel plating of the robot not as a solid barrier, but as a collection of weak points, seams, and joints. Saikuru. Rhino's cycle. He violently uncrossed his arms, unleashing a dual, upward diagonal slash. The blades didn't just cut. The kinetic energy of One for All, channeled to a razor-thin edge, sheared through the heavy armor plating of the 3-pointer as if it were made of wet tissue paper. The sound of rending metal shrieked through the alley as the top half of the robot was cleanly severed from its treads. Sparks showered the alley as the 2 halves of the robot slid apart, crashing to the ground in a heap of smoking machinery. Izuku didn't pause to admire his work. He kicked off the falling wreckage, propelling himself out of the alley and into the main street. A group of 4 one-pointers, resembling mechanical hounds, locked onto him and charged. Izuku hit the pavement running. He spun his swords in his hands, reversing his grip. He closed his eyes, trusting entirely in his hockey. He wove through the lunging robots with terrifying, phantom-like grace. Every time a robot snapped its metal jaws at him, Izuku pivoted, deflecting the attack with the flat of a blade, and countered with a blindingly fast, surgical strike to their central battery cores. Within 5 seconds the 4 robots were reduced to sparking scrap metal. 7 points, Izuku tallied in his head, flicking the oil off his blades with the snap of his wrists. The blades are holding up. The energy flow is stable. I can push it further. In the observation room, the silence was palpable. Aizawa was leaning forward so far he was almost touching the glass of the monitor. His tired eyes were wide with genuine shock. Did you see that? Snipe whispered, his hand hovering over his holster. He didn't just cut them. He bypassed their armor completely. The edges of those cuts are surgically smooth. He's using a quirk, Midnight observed, watching the replay. You can see the green lightning discharging from his body. It looks like an energy stockpile or a kinetic enhancement. But he's registered as quirkless, Niza hummed, his paws steepled in front of his face. Fascinating. Perhaps a late bloomer, or a power that only activates under extreme physical conditioning. Regardless, his technique with those blades is not the result of a quirk. That is decades of martial mastery. How old did you say he was? 14, Aizawa read, his voice grim. A 14-year-old who fights like a veteran assassin. All Might grinned proudly in the shadows. Yes, Midoriya. Show them the fruits of your labor. Back in the battle center, the exam had devolved into chaos. The other examinees were fighting desperately for scraps, firing lasers, explosions, and elemental attacks at the remaining robots. But Izuku had claimed the eastern quadrant of the city entirely for himself. He was a force of nature. He didn't fight like a hero trying to subdue villains. He fought like a demon clearing a battlefield. He incorporated acrobatic flips, heavy kicks, and devastating parries into his swordplay. Whenever a two-pointer tried to strike him, he would meet the massive metal fists with his blades, the kinetic force of one for all allowing him to block attacks that should have pulverized a human body. He found a cluster of 10 robots swarming a panicked examinee. Izuku blitzed past the boy, his swords a blur of silver and black. Nitoriu Nijirai. Toro. Two-sword style, double slash. Climbing tower. He launched himself upward, delivering 2 simultaneous, vertical slashes that cleaved through 3 two-pointers at once, the sheer wind pressure of the attack knocking the remaining robots off their feet. He landed softly, sheathing Sanai Kitetsu and Wado Ikimanji with identical, satisfying clicks. 54 points, Izuku noted, his breathing slightly elevated. The 5% output was taxing his muscles, but the pain was manageable, a dull burn that he welcomed. That should be enough to pass the combat portion. He stood in the center of the street, surrounded by dozens of bisected, sparking robot corpses. Other examinees arrived in the area, freezing in their tracks as they took in the absolute carnage. Tenya Ida ran around the corner, his engine legs venting steam. He stopped dead, his jaw dropping as he saw Izuku standing calmly amidst the destruction. He did this? Ida thought, his earlier arrogance shattering completely. With just swords? He isn't a tryhard. He's a monster. 7 minutes remaining. Present Mike announced over the speakers. Izuku sighed, rolling his shoulders. I guess I'll hunt a few more. Might as well secure the top rank. He reached for his swords again, but suddenly, the ground beneath his feet trembled. It wasn't a minor tremor. The concrete buckled, the streetlights swayed violently, and the glass windows of the surrounding buildings shattered simultaneously. A shadow fell over the street, blocking out the sun. Izuku looked up. Rising from the center of the mock city, crushing a 3-story building beneath its massive treads, was the zero-pointer. It was gargantuan, easily the size of a skyscraper, its massive optical sensor glowing an ominous, bloody red. The sheer scale of the machine was terrifying, dwarfing everything around it. The obstacle, Izuku murmured, his eyes narrowing. Run! An examinee screamed. Panic consumed the street. The candidates, realizing their quirks were entirely useless against a machine of that magnitude, turned and sprinted in the opposite direction. Ida turned to run as well, his engines roaring to life. Izuku turned his back on the giant robot. A waste of time and energy, he thought rationally. It's too heavily armored for a superficial cut, and I don't need the points. He took 1 step away. Crash! A massive piece of debris from a destroyed building rained down, slamming into the street behind him. The shockwave knocked several fleeing examinees to the ground. Through the chaos, the roaring engines, and the screaming teenagers, Izuku's observation haki picked up a sharp, piercing spike of pain and terror. He stopped. He turned his head. Through the dust and smoke, pinned beneath a massive slab of concrete, was the girl from the entrance. Uraraka. Her leg was trapped, her face pale with agony as she struggled to push the rubble away. The zero-pointer slowly raised its massive foot, the shadow falling directly over her. It was going to crush her, and it wouldn't even notice. In the observation room, the teachers tensed. The robot is too close to her. Hit the emergency kill switch. Midnight yelled, reaching for the console. Wait, Aizawa ordered, his eyes locked on Izuku's monitor. Look at him. In the street, Izuku Midoriya stood perfectly still. The rational, analytical part of his brain, Deku, screamed to run to her, to lift the rubble, to pull her to safety. But there wasn't enough time. The foot was already descending. He couldn't reach her and pull her out before the metal crushed them both. To save her, he had to stop the robot. The ghost of Roronoa Zoro laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed in the caverns of his soul. A swordsman does not flee from a mountain. He cuts it down. Izuku reached to his right hip. He didn't draw 2 swords. He drew all 3. He clamped the pure white hilt of Wado Ikimanji firmly between his teeth. He gripped Sanai Kitetsu in his left hand, and Shusui in his right. He didn't run toward the robot. He planted his feet firmly into the cracked pavement, sinking into a low, impossibly wide stance. He closed his eyes. 5% won't dent that armor, Izuku calculated. I need more. I need to push the dam. He opened the floodgates. 10%. 15%. 20% of one for all rushed into his body. The pain was instantaneous and excruciating. His muscles screamed, tearing and reforming on a microscopic level. The green lightning surrounding him erupted, violently whipping the dust and debris away from his body. But Izuku didn't stop there. He knew the raw kinetic energy would shatter his swords the moment they met the air pressure. Armor, Izuku commanded his soul. Coat the blades. Protect the steel. For the first time in his new life, it answered. A deep, invisible, spiritual pressure flared from his chest. It rushed down his arms, mixing with the violently sparking green lightning of One for All. The two energies combined, creating a terrifying, dark emerald black aura that coated the steel of his swords. The blades didn't turn completely black, but they darkened significantly, humming with a frequency that distorted the air itself. Uraraka, crying in pain, looked up through the dust. She saw the green-haired boy standing alone against the mechanical titan. He looked like a demon, surrounded by black and green lightning, a third sword clamped in his jaw. Izuku opened his eyes. They were glowing with a predatory, luminous intensity. He brought Shusui and Kitetsu over his right shoulder, crossing them behind his head, while angling Wado Ikimanji horizontally in his mouth. He didn't just target the foot. He targeted the absolute center of the robot's mass. Santoryu. Three-sword style. Izuku roared through the sword in his mouth, a primal, earth-shaking sound that carried over the roaring engines of the machine. He swung all three swords forward with everything he had, twisting his torso with explosive, devastating force. Hyakuchi Pound Ho. 108-pound Phoenix. He didn't make physical contact with the robot. He didn't need to. The sheer, catastrophic physical force of the swing, augmented by 20% of One for All and coated in armament hockey, grabbed the atmosphere and weaponized it. A massive, crescent-shaped blade of highly compressed, glowing green-black air erupted from his swords. The flying slash was over 60 feet tall, shrieking through the air like a screaming banshee. It tore a massive trench through the concrete street as it flew, vaporizing the debris in its path. The flying slash struck the zero-pointer directly in its chest chassis. There was no explosion. There was no resistance. The air blade sheared through the unimaginably thick titanium armor of the giant robot as cleanly as a hot knife slicing through butter. It entered the chest, sliced completely through the internal machinery, and burst out the back, continuing its trajectory until it dissipated into the clouds above the battle center. Silence descended on the mock city. The zero-pointer froze. Its glowing red optical sensor flickered, then died. For 2 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening, agonizing groan of rending metal, the upper half of the zero-pointer slowly slid backward. The sheer weight of the severed machinery caused it to topple, crashing to the ground far behind its legs in a catastrophic explosion of dust, fire, and shattered gears. The bottom half, perfectly severed at a diagonal angle, stood completely still, sparks raining down from the clean, glowing orange cut. Izuku stood at the end of the street, breathing heavily. The green lightning faded from his body. His arms felt like they were filled with molten lead, trembling violently from the strain of channeling 20%. Blood dripped from his nose, and his jaw ached terribly, but his bones were intact. The swords had held. He slowly, methodically sheathed his 3 swords. Click. 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 He walked toward Uraraka. The remaining examinees, who had stopped fleeing to watch the spectacle, parted for him as if he were a god walking among mortals. Izuku reached Uraraka. He looked at the massive slab of concrete pinning her leg. He bent down, grabbed the edge of the slab with his bare hands, and with a grunt of exertion, casually heaved the 2-ton piece of debris off her and tossed it aside. He knelt beside her, his terrifying aura dissipating entirely, replaced by a calm, clinical concern. "Is it broken?" he asked, pointing to her leg. Uraraka stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She looked at the cleanly bisected remnants of a building-sized robot, then back at the boy who had just done it with a sword swing from 50 yards away. I think so," she squeaked, her mind unable to process reality. "Don't move it. The medical staff will be here shortly," Izuku advised. "Time's up." Present Mick's voice echoed through the city, noticeably subdued. In the observation room, there was absolute, pin-drop silence. Nise's teacup was frozen halfway to his mouth. Midnight was staring at the screen, her eyes wide. Snipe had taken his hat off. Aizawa slowly zipped his sleeping bag all the way up to his chin, hiding the massive, terrifying grin that was spreading across his face. A flying slash that cut a building-sized target in half without a quirk-enhancing blade, Aizawa thought, his heart racing with anticipation. Problem child. We have a massive problem child on our hands. All Might was trembling in the shadows, tears of pure joy streaming down his skeletal face. "You didn't just cage the storm, my boy," Toshinori thought proudly. "You directed it. You truly are the greatest." Down in the battle center, a small, elderly woman with a syringe-shaped walking stick hobbled through the crowd. Recovery girl had arrived. "Out of the way, out of the way. Let me see the injured," she commanded. Izuku stood up, offering Uraraka a slight nod, before turning and walking away. The adrenaline was fading, and the immense physical toll of his first hockey-infused one-for-all attack was catching up to him. He desperately wanted a nap. He ignored the stares, the whispers, and the terrified respect of the other examinees. He walked out the open gates of the battle center, intent on heading straight to the train station to go home. 10 minutes later, Izuku stood in front of a massive, heavily fortified door marked Support Course Development Studio. "Do not enter." He stared at the door, then at the map in his hand, then back at the door. "I walked in a straight line from the gate," Izuku grumbled to himself, rubbing his aching temples. "How did I end up in the basement?" A muffled explosion echoed from behind the door, followed by a maniacal girl's laughter. Izuku sighed, turning around and choosing a random hallway. "I guess I live at Yue now."